The night the maid first stepped into the mansion, the man in the wheelchair was already watching her. For months he had lived in that dark room at the end of the hallway, staring through tall glass windows that overlooked acres of land he once walked across with pride. People across the country knew his name, Daniel Whitmore, a self-made millionaire who had built an empire out of real estate deals and relentless ambition. His life had once been a parade of luxury, private jets waiting on silent runways, polished boardrooms where every word he spoke moved millions of dollars, and a mansion so large that new visitors often got lost before they reached the main staircase. But wealth has a strange way of gathering people around you who love the power more than the person who holds it. Daniel discovered that truth the hard way after a single moment changed everything. One late evening, while returning from a business meeting outside Denver, his car slid on an icy mountain road. The crash was violent. Metal folded against metal, glass shattered across the highway, and the next thing Daniel remembered was the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room and a doctor explaining that his spinal cord had been badly damaged. The man who had spent his entire life running forward suddenly found himself trapped in a chair, dependent on nurses, assistants, and employees who moved around him like shadows. At first, the sympathy poured in. Friends visited. Business partners called daily. But sympathy fades quickly when the person receiving it no longer holds the same power. Within months, the phone calls slowed. Meetings happened without him. Decisions were made in offices he once controlled. And in the enormous mansion that had once echoed with laughter during parties and celebrations, silence began to settle like dust. Daniel Whitmore sat alone most nights, staring into the dark reflection of the window, wondering how many of the people around him were still there for him, and how many were simply waiting for the empire to collapse so they could take their share. Then one morning the front door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, carrying a worn suitcase that looked far too small for the long journey it had likely taken her to arrive there. Her name was Emily Carter. She had come looking for work as a maid, a job most people in the mansion accepted only after every other opportunity had disappeared. Emily was quiet, almost invisible at first glance, the kind of person people overlook when they're too busy thinking about their own problems. But Daniel noticed her immediately. Perhaps it was the way she walked through the grand halls without staring at the chandeliers or the marble floors the way most new employees did. Perhaps it was the calm expression she carried even while the house manager explained the strict rules of working for a man known across the business world for his unforgiving personality. Or perhaps Daniel simply recognized something familiar in her eyes, a kind of silent determination that reminded him of the person he used to be before the accident. What no one inside that mansion knew at the time was that the meeting between the wealthy man in the wheelchair and the quiet maid who had arrived with almost nothing would slowly turn into a story that neither of them expected. Because Daniel Whitmore had a secret he had never shared with anyone inside that house. And Emily Carter carried a secret of her own that would eventually change the life of the man who believed everyone around him only cared about his money. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, the relationship between Daniel Whitmore and the young maid who had quietly arrived at his mansion seemed impossible. Daniel was a man who had spent decades building one of the most respected real estate empires in the country. His name appeared in financial magazines, business conferences, and investment reports across the United States. He had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, controlled entire city blocks of development, and built a reputation for being a man who never tolerated weakness. Before the accident, people described him as brilliant, disciplined, and relentless. After the accident, however, something inside him had changed. The injury had taken away more than the ability to walk. It had taken away the sense of control he once had over his life, and in its place grew a quiet anger that few people understood. Employees inside the mansion quickly learned that working for Daniel Whitmore was nothing like working for anyone else. Orders were given without patience. Mistakes were met with sharp criticism. Several housekeepers had already quit within weeks of starting their jobs. Some left in tears, Others left without even collecting their final paycheck. But Emily Carter did not leave. She arrived with that same small suitcase, placed it neatly inside the modest staff room at the far end of the hallway, and began working as if the tension in the house did not exist. She cleaned the enormous marble floors, prepared meals, and carried trays into Daniel's study without saying more than a few respectful words. What confused the other employees was the fact that she never complained, even when Daniel's temper flared, even when his instructions were delivered in a tone that made others uncomfortable. Emily Carter simply nodded and continued doing her job. The contrast between them could not have been greater. Daniel Whitmore had grown up chasing ambition, driven by the belief that power and success were the only reliable protections in a difficult world. Emily Carter had grown up in a small farming community where survival meant hard work, patience, and quiet resilience. He lived surrounded by luxury that most people could only imagine. She carried only a few belongings and the determination to earn enough money to move forward with her life. Yet over the next few months, something unusual began to unfold inside the mansion. Daniel found himself paying attention to Emily in ways he had not intended. He noticed that she never reacted the way other employees did when he raised his voice. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply listened and carried on with her work, as if she understood something about his anger that the others did not. And slowly, questions began to form in Daniel's mind. Why did Emily Carter refuse to quit when so many others had walked away? Why did she remain calm in a house where tensions seemed to follow him everywhere? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, what was the real reason she had come to work in a mansion owned by a man known for driving people away? The answers would not come immediately. Weeks passed with the same quiet routine. But late one night, while Daniel Whitmore sat alone in his study watching the security monitors he had installed throughout the mansion, he would witness something that forced him to question everything he believed about the young woman working under his roof. And on that quiet night, the truth about Emily Carter would begin to reveal itself in a way Daniel could never have expected. Long before the accident placed him in a wheelchair, Daniel Whitmore had been known across the country as one of the most relentless figures in American real estate. He did not inherit wealth. He built it. Starting with a single small investment property in his early 20s, Daniel spent decades turning modest deals into massive developments that reshaped entire neighborhoods. His colleagues often described him as a man who could walk into a room and immediately see opportunity where others only saw risk. Over the years, that instinct made him extraordinarily wealthy. His company expanded into multiple cities, and his name appeared regularly in financial publications that praised his ability to predict the next profitable project before anyone else noticed it. To his investors, he was a visionary. To his competitors, he was a force they could never fully keep up with. But success like that rarely comes without sacrifice. Daniel worked constantly, sometimes sleeping only a few hours a night while reviewing contracts and construction plans. Relationships outside of business became secondary. Friends often joked that Daniel Whitmore treated deals like family and treated everything else like background noise. Yet even the most disciplined life can be interrupted by a single unexpected moment. The night of the accident was cold and quiet. Daniel had been returning from a late meeting with developers outside Denver, driving through a stretch of mountain highway that twisted through dark forest roads. According to the police report, a patch of black ice caused the car to lose control. The vehicle slid across the narrow lane before striking the guardrail and flipping down a steep embankment. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but the damage had already been done. When Daniel regained consciousness in the hospital, the doctors explained the severity of his injuries with careful words. The spinal damage was extensive. Walking again would be unlikely. For a man who had spent his entire life moving forward faster than everyone around him, the news felt almost impossible to accept. Recovery was slow and frustrating. Physical therapy sessions stretched for months with little improvement. At first, many people visited him during his time in the hospital. Business partners brought flowers. Investors sent messages of encouragement. But as the weeks passed, and it became clear that Daniel would not return to the fast-paced world he once controlled, the attention began to fade. Meetings moved on without him. Some of the partners he had trusted most began making decisions independently, quietly shifting power inside the company. By the time Daniel returned to his mansion, the empire he had built no longer felt entirely like his own. The house that had once been filled with activity now felt unusually quiet. Staff members moved carefully around him, unsure how to interact with the man who had once commanded every room he entered. Daniel spent long hours in his study overlooking the property, watching the distant tree line and thinking about how quickly life can change when the one thing you relied on most is taken away. While Daniel Whitmore struggled to adjust to the new reality of his life, Emily Carter was beginning a journey that would eventually bring her directly into that same mansion. Emily's story had started in a very different place. She grew up in a small rural town several states away, the daughter of farmers who spent their lives working a modest piece of land that had been in the family for generations. The farm was never large, and the work was never easy. Emily learned early how to wake before sunrise, help with chores, and understand the quiet discipline that rural life demands from everyone who depends on it. Her parents believed strongly in honesty and perseverance, values they passed to their daughter through years of simple routines and hard work. But life on the farm began to change when a series of financial difficulties struck the region. Crop prices dropped, equipment repairs became expensive, and medical bills slowly began to pile up after Emily's father fell ill. Within a few years, the family was facing debts that could no longer be managed by farming alone. Emily watched her parents struggle to hold onto the land they loved, working longer hours while quietly worrying about whether the farm could survive another season. When her father's health worsened and her mother could no longer manage the work alone, Emily made a decision that would send her far away from the only home she had ever known. She packed a small suitcase, said goodbye to the field she had grown up walking through, and boarded a long-distance bus headed toward the city where she hoped to find employment. The journey took nearly 2 days, and when the bus finally arrived, she stepped off with little more than determination and a few belongings. The job at Daniel Whitmore's mansion was not the first position she applied for, but it was the one that offered immediate work and a place to stay. On a rainy Monday morning, Emily Carter stood outside the gates of the enormous property, her suitcase resting beside her as she waited for someone to open the door. To anyone watching, she appeared calm, almost reserved, but beneath that quiet composure, she carried the weight of everything she had left behind. The mansion represented a chance to earn enough money to help her family survive the difficult months ahead. What Daniel Whitmore did not know at the time was that the young woman who had just entered his home had come carrying a burden far heavier than the suitcase she held in her hand. Emily Carter had left her farm with a secret she had told almost no one, and the truth behind that secret would eventually change the course of both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The first real moment of tension between Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter happened only a few hours after she began working inside the mansion. Daniel had already spent most of the morning in his study, reviewing documents that his company had forwarded to him for approval. Even though he was no longer physically present in the boardrooms where decisions were made, he still insisted on maintaining some level of control over the business he had built. By midday, the house manager instructed Emily to prepare Daniel's lunch and bring it directly to his office. It was a simple task, the kind of routine responsibility that every maid in the mansion had performed at one time or another. Emily carried the tray carefully through the long hallway, balancing a bowl of soup, a sandwich, and a glass of water as she approached the heavy wooden door. When she knocked gently and stepped inside, Daniel looked up from the papers spread across his desk with an expression that revealed little warmth. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock mounted above the fireplace. Emily walked forward and placed a tray in front of him. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, Daniel pushed the tray forward with a sudden movement of his arm. The bowl slid across the polished surface and fell onto the floor, sending hot soup spilling across the carpet and splashing against Emily's hands. The heat caused her fingers to jerk instinctively, but she did not shout or react the way many people would have in that situation. She simply stood there for a brief moment, absorbing the shock of what had happened, before kneeling down to clean the mess. Daniel watched her closely while she gathered the broken pieces of the bowl and wiped the carpet with a cloth. Most employees would have been visibly upset or angry after being treated that way. Some might have argued. Others would have walked out immediately. But Emily Carter said nothing. She finished cleaning the floor, collected the tray, and quietly left the room as if the incident were nothing more than an unfortunate accident. For Daniel, the silence was almost more unsettling than any reaction she could have given. Over the next few days, similar moments occurred again. Daniel would call for assistance only to criticize the way something had been done. Instructions were delivered in a sharp tone. At times, he deliberately tested her patience by asking for unnecessary tasks, sending her back and forth across the mansion to bring items he could easily have reached himself if his legs had still worked the way they once did. The other employees in the house began whispering among themselves about how long the new maid would last. They had seen this pattern before. Daniel Whitmore's frustration had driven away several workers since the accident. Some lasted a week. Others managed a month before deciding that no job was worth enduring the constant tension inside the mansion. Yet Emily Carter did not leave. Day after day, she continued performing her duties with the same quiet focus she had shown on the morning she arrived. She cleaned the large rooms, prepared meals in the kitchen, and assisted the house staff whenever needed. Even when Daniel's temper surfaced again, she responded with calm patience that seemed almost impossible to explain. It slowly became clear that she possessed a level of resilience the others did not fully understand. From Daniel's perspective, the situation was becoming increasingly confusing. He had grown accustomed to people reacting strongly to his behavior, especially after the accident. In his mind, the anger he directed at employees was a way of protecting himself from disappointment. Over time, he had convinced himself that nearly everyone around him remained in his life only because of his wealth. If they were treated poorly, they would eventually reveal their true intentions by leaving when the situation became uncomfortable. That belief had hardened into a quiet rule he carried in his mind. Loyalty was rare, and kindness often came with hidden motives. But Emily Carter did not fit easily into that rule. Despite the tension he created, she stayed. Despite the long hours and occasional harsh words, she continued showing up every morning ready to work. Weeks passed, and Daniel began noticing something about her that unsettled him even more than her patience. There was a strength in the way she carried herself, a calm steadiness that made it difficult for him to understand what truly motivated her to remain in a place where so many others had chosen to walk away. And as the days turned into months, the quiet determination Emily displayed began to create a question in Daniel Whitmore's mind that he could not easily answer. Why would anyone stay in a job like that unless there was a reason far deeper than the paycheck she received at the end of each week? By the time several months had passed since Emily Carter arrived at the Whitmore mansion, Daniel Whitmore had begun paying closer attention to the people working inside his home than anyone realized. What most of the staff did not know was that the mansion's security system had been quietly expanded not long after Daniel returned from the hospital. Small cameras had been installed in several hallways, entrances, and common areas throughout the house. The official explanation was security, but Daniel had another reason. After the accident, trust had become difficult for him. He wanted to understand how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. Late at night, when the house grew quiet and the staff had finished their duties, Daniel often remained awake in his study reviewing the monitors connected to those cameras. It became a strange routine. While the rest of the mansion slept, he sat in front of the screens observing the quiet movements of a place that once felt lively and full of conversation. On most nights, there was nothing unusual to see. The hallways remained empty. The kitchen lights were turned off. Occasionally, a staff member would walk past on the way to their room, but the silence usually returned within minutes. Then one night, a little after 2 in the morning, something on the monitor caught his attention. The kitchen light had been turned on. Daniel adjusted the screen and leaned forward slightly in his chair as the camera displayed the image more clearly. Sitting alone at the large wooden table was Emily Carter. She appeared different from the composed employee he had grown accustomed to seeing during the day. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and her hands rested on the table as if she had been sitting there for some time. Daniel watched quietly as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Even through the grainy image of the security feed, he could see her studying it with careful attention. After a moment, she placed the photograph on the table beneath the light. Daniel could now see what she was looking at. The picture showed a modest farm surrounded by open fields. Standing in front of the house were two elderly people, a man and a woman who appeared to be smiling despite the worn look of the building behind them. Emily kept staring at the image as if it represented something she was trying desperately to hold on to. A few seconds later, she lifted her phone and dialed a number. Daniel could not hear everything clearly through the system, but the microphones installed in the room captured enough of the conversation to reach his speakers. Her voice sounded tired, almost fragile, nothing like the steady tone she used during the day while working around the house. She spoke quietly at first, explaining something about paperwork and property documents. Then her words became more urgent. She said she needed the sale completed immediately. The price did not matter. She simply needed the money as quickly as possible. At first, Daniel assumed the explanation was obvious. Many employees who passed through his house were motivated by financial desperation, and hearing someone discuss selling property late at night seemed to confirm the suspicion he already carried about people's intentions. But then Emily spoke again, and the next sentence forced Daniel to sit back in his chair with a completely different expression. She explained to the person on the phone that the money was needed for medical treatment. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued speaking. The surgery, she said, might allow him to walk again. The insurance company would not cover the procedure. It was too expensive and considered uncertain. There was a long pause after those words, as if the person on the other end of the call was asking questions Daniel could not hear. Emily wiped her eyes before answering. She said she understood the land had been in the family for generations. She understood what selling it meant. But none of that mattered anymore, because someone's future depended on finding the money quickly. When Daniel realized who she was talking about, the quiet room around him suddenly felt very different. Emily Carter was not trying to raise money for herself. She was trying to raise money for him. The photograph she had been holding showed the farm she grew up on, the land that likely represented everything her family had worked for across decades. And in that silent kitchen, long after everyone else in the mansion had gone to sleep, she had made the decision to sell it in order to pay for a surgery that might give Daniel Whitmore a chance to walk again. For several seconds, Daniel simply stared at the screen without moving. The belief he had carried for months, the idea that people stayed around him only because of his wealth, suddenly felt less certain. Because the one person he had treated with the most coldness inside that mansion was quietly preparing to sacrifice the only thing she had left in the world in order to help him recover a life he thought was already gone. The discovery that night did not allow Daniel Whitmore to sleep. Long after the security monitor had gone dark and Emily Carter had returned to her room, he remained in his study, staring at the blank screen in front of him. For months, he had convinced himself that the world around him had become predictable in the worst possible way. He believed that loyalty disappeared the moment his ability to walk disappeared. He believed every person who worked inside the mansion was there because of the salary attached to the job. The accident had taken more than his mobility. It had slowly taken away his willingness to believe in the sincerity of other people. Yet the scene he had just witnessed made that belief feel suddenly fragile. Emily Carter had not asked him for anything. She had not mentioned surgery. She had not even hinted that she was trying to help him. Instead, she had chosen to carry that burden alone, quietly preparing to sacrifice the land her family depended on so that a man who had barely treated her with kindness might have another chance to stand again. The realization stayed with Daniel throughout the rest of the night. When morning arrived and the first light reached the windows of the mansion, he was still awake, still thinking about the quiet strength he had seen in Emily the night before. As the household began its usual routine, Emily eventually walked down the hallway toward Daniel's study, carrying a tray of breakfast. Her expression looked the same as it always had, calm and focused on the responsibilities of her workday. She knocked gently before stepping inside the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel watched her set the tray on the desk, noticing details he had overlooked before, the careful way she arranged the dishes, the slight fatigue visible in her eyes, the quiet patience she seemed to carry with her everywhere she went. Finally, Daniel broke the silence with a question that came from a place deeper than his usual sharp tone. He asked her why she had chosen to do something so extraordinary for a man who had given her so little reason to care. Emily paused, surprised by the directness of the question, but she did not look frightened. Instead, she answered in the same calm voice Daniel had heard the night before in the kitchen. She explained that sometimes people need a second chance, even when they do not ask for it. She said that pain can change people, but it does not erase who they truly are inside. Then she added something that seemed to echo through the quiet room. She said everyone deserves another chance, even him. The words lingered between them for several seconds as Daniel absorbed their meaning. In that moment, the anger he had carried since the accident felt strangely distant. Slowly, almost cautiously, Daniel placed his hands on the arms of the chair and shifted his weight forward. The movement was small at first, uncertain after months of depending entirely on the wheelchair. But then something unexpected happened. With Emily standing quietly across the room, Daniel Whitmore pushed himself upward. For the first time since the accident, the man who had once believed his life was permanently confined to that chair managed to rise to his feet. The moment Daniel Whitmore stood in that quiet room did not instantly erase the months of struggle he had endured since the accident. His legs were weak, his balance uncertain, and the effort required to remain upright lasted only a few seconds before he slowly lowered himself back into the wheelchair. But those few seconds changed something inside him that had remained frozen since the night of the crash. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to believe that the future might still hold possibilities he had already given up on. What followed over the next several weeks was a process far more demanding than the brief moment Emily Carter had witnessed that morning. Daniel met with specialists recommended by physicians who had been studying new surgical approaches for spinal injuries. The procedure was complicated and expensive, the kind of operation insurance companies often refuse to approve because the outcome could never be guaranteed. Yet the sacrifice Emily had been willing to make forced Daniel to reconsider the way he approached his own recovery. Instead of accepting limitations, he began exploring every possible option that might allow him to regain the independence he once had. Months passed as medical consultations, rehabilitation plans, and surgical preparations slowly unfolded. Through all of it, Emily remained part of the quiet routine inside the mansion. She continued working as she always had, never drawing attention to the choice she had nearly made in that dim kitchen late at night. Daniel never forgot what he had seen on the security camera, but he also understood something important about Emily's character. She had not acted out of expectation or a desire for recognition. Her decision had come from a belief that helping someone in need was simply the right thing to do. When the day of the surgery finally arrived, Daniel faced it with a sense of determination he had not felt since before the accident. The procedure lasted several hours, and the recovery that followed required patience and careful rehabilitation. Progress was slow at first, measured in small improvements that most people would barely notice. But each week brought another step forward. Physical therapy sessions grew longer. Movements that once felt impossible gradually became manageable. Eventually, Daniel reached a point where standing no longer required the same level of struggle it once had. By the time several more months had passed, the transformation inside the Whitmore mansion had become visible to everyone who worked there. The man who had once isolated himself behind the closed door of his study now spent time walking slowly through the halls, practicing the movements his body had relearned through persistent effort. Yet the most important change had little to do with his ability to walk. The accident had once convinced Daniel that loyalty was an illusion, something people pretended to offer while secretly pursuing their own interests. Emily Carter's quiet act of compassion forced him to reconsider that belief. She had shown him a kind of loyalty that asked for nothing in return, a willingness to stand beside someone who had given her no reason to stay. In time, Daniel made sure that Emily's family farm was never sold. The debts that had threatened to take the land from her parents were quietly resolved through arrangements Daniel personally ensured were handled with dignity and respect. Emily never asked for that help, but Daniel understood that gratitude sometimes requires actions rather than words. The mansion itself began to feel different as well. The tension that once filled the rooms slowly disappeared, replaced by a calmer atmosphere where employees no longer felt the same pressure that had driven so many away. Daniel Whitmore had spent much of his life believing strength came from power and control. The accident and the events that followed taught him something far more meaningful. Strength can also come from compassion, patience, and the willingness to believe in people even when life has given you reasons not to. In the end, the greatest lesson Daniel Whitmore learned after losing the ability to walk was not about business or ambition. It was about understanding the value of loyalty when it appears in its most unexpected form. Sometimes the people who appear the weakest are the ones strong enough to change everything. If you were in Daniel Whitmore's position, would you have trusted Emily Carter after everything that happened? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in this situation. And if you enjoy powerful real-life stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story.